Gary Locke was named the American ambassador to China in March 2011. In naming him to the post, President Obama stated that our relationship with China is one of the most critical of the 21st century. Continued cooperation between our countries will be good for America, it will be good for China, and it will be good for the world. The new United States ambassador to China was born in the state of Washington, a son of Chinese immigrants. His grandfather came to the state a little more than 100 years ago to work as a domestic servant for a family in exchange for English lessons. His grandfather returned to China, but Gary's father eventually immigrated to the United States. Locke was well known in his home state for cultivating a strong relationship with China over many years, netting 235,000 jobs for his fellow Washingtonians. 1972 marked the historical meeting between then-President Richard M. Nixon and the Chinese Premier Mao Zedong. Under the umbrella of ping-pong diplomacy, China and the United States timidly opened the door to one another. Reasons for the change in policy between the two superpowers is highly complex, but trade and China's fear of Soviet intentions, as well as the horrible destruction to the Chinese economy as a result of the Sino-Soviet split, forced the Chinese leadership to look elsewhere if China were to survive and to succeed. Before Nixon's intended meeting with the Soviet leadership in Moscow in 1972, he made a stop in Beijing, which would forever alter the destinies of both the Chinese and the Americans. In 1951, the United States cut off all ties with Communist China. By 1989, the full relationship between the two had been restored. In 1994, President Bill Clinton renewed Most Favored Nation status with China. In doing so, Clinton recognized that the $8 billion in trade flowing between the two countries had a highly significant effect on foreign policy. The refreshed alliance was heralded as a permanent link that now had been forged between the two countries. Alliances, trade, and commerce had replaced hatred, failed diplomacy, and fear of one another. While some might argue that the status, whether one of favored nation or permanent relation, was not particularly an exclusive club, there was no doubt that between China and the United States, a marriage had taken place, with all the traditional trappings of embondment, of one to the other in front of the entire world, for all to see and consider. In 2005, Chinese customs reported $35 billion in international trade. That year, the United States was the greatest exporter of agricultural products to China. China was deemed to have the fourth largest economy in the world. By 2011, China has become the second largest economy in the world, moving Japan to the number 3 spot. It is widely speculated that China is rapidly closing the gap between itself and the United States, to ultimately become the largest economy in the world. A re-examination of the United States and its relationship with China is intrinsic to the future course of the American way of life. Many Americans believe, from citizens to mayors to governors to the American president himself, that a relationship with China ought to be pursued. Intrinsic to that belief is faith in American resiliency and her ability to adapt to the changing times. Endemic to her resiliency is her innate intelligence as a nation. Knowledge, understanding, and fortitude underscores her resiliency, as it always has. Americans know how to roll up their sleeves. They also have a tendency to see competitors as friends. The relationship of Colorado to China has its roots in a checkered past, not unlike the general history of other migrations to the American West. A virulent and contentious history at the end of the 19th century was matched by a change for the better for the descendants of these first Chinese in the 20th century. In 1858, gold was discovered in Colorado. Chinese immigrants, fresh from the gold fields of California, flocked to Colorado to work in the gold and coal mines and to help build the railroads in Colorado and the West. After the end of the Civil War, more Chinese immigrants came, swelling the number of Chinese in the state. Chinese businesses flourished in Colorado. They were initially established to serve their fellow Chinese. These businesses quickly grew to serve the greater population of Colorado. But the relationship of the Chinese immigrant to the burgeoning non-Chinese population had its dark side. On November 10, 1880, a riot broke out in Denver, soon becoming known as the Hot Valley Riot. A mob of thousands stormed Chinese businesses. One Chinese lost his life. Claims totaling $30,000 in damages to Chinese businesses were never settled. At the same time, Coloradoans fought alongside the Chinese, defending them during the riots. In March 1910, Dr. Sun Yat-sen was visiting Denver, hoping to raise sympathy and cash for the cause of the new Chinese Republic. When he arrived, over 3,000 Chinese came out to greet his train. He was staying at the Brown Palace when he heard the Manchu dynasty was about to be overthrown. Soon, the author of the Chinese Constitution, and soon to become president of the new republic, began his final sojourn home to China from Denver. In 1915, Lilia Hinckley, a University of Colorado graduate, went to China. She arrived in Old Peking, Peiping, now Beijing, in 1921 to work as a secretary for the National Board of the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association. Lilia spent 30 years in China, helping to establish medical clinics, playgrounds, and schools. She survived the Second World War as a prisoner of the Japanese in an internment camp. She returned to China after the war was over. On January 8, 1937, the St. Petersburg Times reported some extraordinary news coming from Xianfu in China's Shansi province. 250,000 Chinese had joined a movement in northwest China to help create what would become the People's Republic of China. Agnes Smedley, a former Colorado schoolteacher, conducted a radio propaganda campaign in Xianfu to attract disaffected military units in Shansi and Gansu provinces to the cause of the Communist Liberation Movement then underway. She came to Xianfu on December 12, 1936, from Shanghai, where she had lived for the past 18 years. She broadcast every half hour with an appeal to Chinese recruits to march on Nanjing.